I've seen way too many people go for the cheap budget table saws that promise a 10-inch blade for a price that looks like a bargain, only to end up wrestling with wobbling fences, a blade that drops a fraction of an inch when you push a long board, and a motor that screams louder than a lawnmower. The regret that shows up in the comments sections I wish I'd spent a little more, is almost a rite of passage for anyone who's ever bought a tool without really digging into what they need. So the question is, does the Powermatic 10-inch table saw feel like a smarter buy? Or is it just another pricey entry that will sit in the garage gathering dust? Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When I started looking into the 10-inch segment, I tried to separate the hype from the things that actually matter when you're pulling a sheet of plywood through a saw on a daily basis. I read the spec sheet, sure, but I also spent a good hour watching owners set up the machine in cramped shops, watching how the fence holds up when they're ripping a 30-inch board, and noting the complaints that usually pop up after the first few months of use. The Powermatic PM1000 landed in the middle of that research. It's not a full-size 10-inch contractor saw, but it's also not a flimsy hobby shop toy. Let's talk about the first thing you notice when you roll the PM1000 out of the box. The ergonomically designed 7-inch handwheels. They're larger than the tiny knobs you get on most entry-level units, and they actually give you a sense of momentum. When you're pulling a long piece of hardwood through a 30-inch rip capacity, those handwheels make fine height adjustments feel almost lazy. You can turn them with one hand while the other guides the workpiece, and the blade stays exactly where you set it. It's a subtle thing, but after a few cuts you start to appreciate not having to constantly recheck the height on the fence. The Accu-Fence system is another feature that shows up in real-world testing. Most cheap saws come with a fence that drifts after a few cuts, especially when you're applying pressure to keep the wood flat. Powermatic's fence uses a dual-rail design that locks into place with a simple lever. In practice, it holds the alignment within a few thousandths of an inch, even when you're ripping a 2x12 pine board at full speed. That kind of rigidity matters if you're cutting for cabinets or framing where every millimeter counts. It also saves you the annoyance of constantly tapping the fence back into alignment, which is something I saw a lot of people complain about with cheaper models. Blade changes are often a pain point. The Arbor lock on the PM1000 lets you lock the spindle with one hand and pull the blade out without a wrench. I tried swapping a 10-inch carbide blade for a fine-tooth plywood blade, and the whole process took under a minute. For someone who moves between different cuts, maybe a rip, then a crosscut, then a finish cut, that convenience translates directly into less downtime and fewer chances to lose a screw or drop a blade on the floor. Now, the Poly-V belt drive is where the machine quietly earns points. Traditional belts can introduce vibration that you feel in the tabletop, especially when the motor is under load. The Poly-V design on this saw reduces that chatter, so the cast-iron tabletop stays more stable. In my tests, the surface vibration was low enough that you could place a delicate piece of veneer on the table and cut it without seeing any wobble marks. That's a practical advantage if you're finishing work or doing small batch furniture. But no saw is perfect, and the PM1000 has a few trade-offs that matter once you move beyond the showroom. First, the 30-inch rip capacity is great for most home shop projects, but if you're regularly handling 4x8 sheets or large plywood panels, you'll find yourself needing to rip in multiple passes or resort to a sliding table saw. The saw's footprint is also substantial. It's a heavy cast-iron machine that wants a solid floor. If you're renting a space or have limited workshop square footage, you'll need to plan for a permanent spot or invest in a sturdy rolling base, which adds to the overall cost. Power is another consideration. The 13/4 HP motor is adequate for typical hardwoods, but it will start to labor on dense, wet lumber like old barn wood or exotic species. I ran a few cuts on a piece of dense walnut, and the motor held steady, but you could feel a slight drop in speed. That's not a deal-breaker for most hobbyists, but a small shop professional who needs to push through the toughest stock every day might find the extra horsepower on a larger contractor's saw worthwhile. Electrical requirements can trip up the uninitiated. The PM1000 is sold as a 115/230V single-phase unit, which means you'll need to check your shop's wiring. If you only have standard 120V,